Whenever you think of Winston Churchill, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Do you seem to always think of a jolly bloke who always wore a little hat and smoked a cigar, and that had it not been for him we'd all be speaking German? Well, if you're the average proud Brit, shut the fuck up! Then that's probably the case. However, I'm very sorry to tell you that I'm actually here to disappoint you by crushing your hilarious dreams with objective historical facts. This is because when it comes to Winston Churchill and the life that he lived, there is an awful lot that the British establishment would very much rather you remained ignorant about. The biggest argument that I tend to hear about Winston Churchill was that he saved the world from the Nazis. I'm not kidding, the vast majority of people here in the UK actually do believe that. The truth, however, is quite shocking, as Churchill was, as a matter of fact, a racist, chauvinist and genocidal maniac who was extremely anti-communist, very reactionary. He had quite a few sympathies for fascism, and he hated the British workers just as much as he hated the colonised people of the British Empire. During the Second World War, Churchill's policies as the Prime Minister and the impact that they had on the territories of the British Empire were just as horrible, and in some cases far worse than those of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Unlike what we are taught to believe by the mainstream education system here in the UK, Churchill's main priority during the Second World War was the British Empire. Yep, a massive colonial empire that spanned across most of the world and pillaged, murdered and massacred many indigenous people. That's why you wouldn't be wrong for thinking that the Second World War, at least before the Soviet Union's involvement, was very much a mere continuation of the First World War, which was an imperialist war on both sides between rival powers who were fighting over colonial territory and spheres of influence. This begins to also make me think that had the Second World War been in favour of the Hitlerites, the Nazis would have just done exactly what the British were doing to their colonies, which was stealing land from indigenous people while also regarding them as inferior, looting their resources and exploiting the labour power of the people there, all to deliver massive profits to the empire. After all, the Nazis were carrying out naked imperialism by attacking other countries for resources and for labour on the basis of racial superiority. I don't think I have to go into much detail about what the Nazis did, since we all learnt about it in primary school and we all learnt about it in secondary school. However, in this video, the fact that I have to go into great detail about the British Empire, which was literally on par with Nazi Germany, says a lot about the intelligence of the average British citizen and why it is a direct result of not fully understanding our history. But that said, although there may very well be some British people watching this who are interested, curious and open to a different perspective, there may also be the odd one or two British people who will be preaching that they're older than me, so that makes them right in every conceivable way. Even though the circumstances of the Second World War ultimately forced Britain to sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union to cooperate with the country in fighting against Nazi Germany, what may be very surprising to some people watching though is that before the war broke out, and to a certain degree during the war as well, Winston Churchill was actually hoping that Nazi Germany would destroy the Soviet Union, which was the world's very first socialist state, which was on the side of the working class and the oppressed people of the world. The rest of the world was pretty damn hostile to the Soviet Union. Immediately after the Bolsheviks seized power, Russia faced a huge wave of imperialist states that tried to invade to crush the revolution. Some of these countries included the United States, Japan, France and Britain. Although the Bolsheviks came out victorious, the results of this civil war, which ended in 1921, were absolutely devastating. Despite the devastation, however, the Bolsheviks managed to buy themselves some time to move on to the big task which was so very important, and that was the construction of socialism. Now, the Soviet Union faced some very hard times during this period, as there were a number of plots, sabotage and assassination attempts that constantly stood in the way of the new socialist state, including difficulties for the Soviet diplomatic service. This really wasn't good at all, since with the rise of fascism in Germany in the midst of the Great Depression, bankers, aristocrats and wealthy capitalists throughout Germany and in other countries flocked to Adolf Hitler, because he was the front man of the industrialists, who was vowing to crush the communists and destroy the trade unions. This was why Hitler ended up getting lots and lots of donations from German capitalists. It's why he had plenty of backing from aristocrats and those from aristocratic backgrounds, and it's why he started doing far better in elections, alongside other sneaky acts like getting the SA to set the Reichstag on fire and blaming it on the communists, just as a way to paint them as insane arsonists. But when Hitler came to power, it really wasn't long before the first concentration camps began opening and people were being sent in them. The first ones on the Nazi Party's hit list were the communists and the trade unionists. Workers in Germany lost practically all of their rights, and they were also heavily taxed. It was because of the Nazis swooping in to save capitalism in a time of crisis that the bourgeoisie in Germany made immense profits under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Indeed, while the Nazis were building up the fascist war machine of Germany and preparing to kickstart the Second World War, Britain and France were signing pact after pact with the Nazis, and the motive behind this was to push the Nazi war machine to go in the direction of the East, towards the Soviet Union. A shameful event that really does back this up was the signing of the Munich Agreement in 1938, in which Britain and France, along with both Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, signed an agreement that effectively allowed the dismantling of Czechoslovakia. What is more shocking to a lot of people is how the Soviet Union could see that a war would be around the corner. So the fact that they were extremely vigilant was one thing, but what a lot of people don't realize is that as the Nazis were building their war machine, while Britain and France were also signing pact after pact with Hitler, Stalin actually intended to propose an alliance with Britain and France to engage in a collective effort to fight Nazi Germany and stop it dead in its tracks. This sort of proposal would have involved a deterrence force of 1 million Soviet troops stationed at the Polish border with Germany, ready to fight Hitler, while Britain and France were stationed in the west. Unfortunately, this proposal was ignored by both Britain and France, not just once, but every single time that Stalin tried to suggest it. Even more sickening is that in Poland, the USSR had offered to defend the country on a number of occasions, but that offer was hindered by the ruling elite of Poland, which was extremely anti-Semitic, showed extreme hatred towards the Soviet Union, and was rather quite friendly with the Nazis. This was why the Polish were very reluctant to allow Red Army troops onto their soil, even though they offered to help the country multiple times. Instead, Poland was stuck in a dream of having Britain and France coming to help them instead, a dream that disappeared in vain, as London and Paris both agreed that Poland would be the stepping stone for the Third Reich to move further to the east. This left the Soviet Union in a very difficult situation, because not only did the country have to remain vigilant of the Nazis attacking them from the west, but Japan also became a threat from the east. Essentially, the USSR was facing the very high chance of fighting a two-front war all on its own. Therefore, in order to buy some time, since Hitler's pure hatred of communism showed that a war against Germany was just inevitable, the Soviet Union ended up making the very painful decision of signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939, because all of the other options had been exhausted. Now, even though the Soviet Union then signed a non-aggression pact with Britain in 1941, the only time Britain really quote-unquote cooperated with the Red Army was when it was becoming quite certain that the Soviet Union was going to reach Berlin first, and the very thought of more of Europe becoming socialist because of the influence of the USSR was terrifying to the Western Allies. This is evident by the fact that Britain and the United States actually refused to open the Second Front. And if you don't know what the Second Front was, it was essentially what we now know as the D-Day landings. It was a plan to land British, American and Canadian troops in France from Britain to provide the Soviet Union with some cover from the West. Now, when Stalin and Churchill actually met in the Kremlin in August of 1942, Stalin actually said to Churchill, "Look, you need to open the second front. But get this, Churchill actually blatantly just refused. When the Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, many experts here in the West predicted that it would only take 6 weeks for the USSR to be crushed. Well, 6 weeks became 6 months. 6 months became 2 years. And by then, the Red Army had managed to liberate Stalingrad, and with the combined efforts of the Soviet guerrilla forces and the partisan resistance movements, they were beginning to push the Nazis back, while also heavily sabotaging the German supply lines in the process. It was then in 1944, when the Red Army was pushing the Nazis back and liberating much of Poland, that with Berlin on the horizon, the Western Allies, shaken by the very thought of Europe becoming a socialist continent, finally decided to land on the beaches of Normandy. In 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Churchill had actually told Stalin and Roosevelt that history would be very kind to him. This is not surprising, since Churchill himself actually made a living from being a writer, as British politicians in the past were not paid. As a paid writer by the bourgeoisie, history has very much been kind to Winston Churchill, as he managed to create a very powerful myth surrounding himself. It is because of this that Churchill's name is far more popular today than it was in the past, when the workers of Britain were not very big fans of him at all. Today, Winston Churchill is seen as one of the greatest treasures of Britain, alongside many famous faces in pop culture. However, I am one of those people who actually challenges this ridiculous narrative that is fed to the average British citizen. And in light of the graffiti that was written on his statue on Parliament Square in London during the Black Lives Matter protests, graffiti which correctly labelled him as a racist, I am going to challenge the mainstream narrative of the British establishment. Even though Churchill is seen as the greatest Briton by the ruling class here in my country, the truth is rather contradictory, as he actually hated the British working class. Through his early life, Churchill served as a soldier in the British Armed Forces, where he took part in many horrific atrocities. Examples of this were when he was posted to Cuba to observe the Spanish, where he then even went as far as to join in and actually help in crushing the independence fighters. He was also posted to India. What's quite interesting about Churchill, though, is that when he had enrolled to join the Sandhurst Academy on the 10th of January in 1893 for officer class, and this officer class took a lot of their ranks from the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, like it still does today. But what Churchill had done when he was in this academy was actually hurt himself while playing some war games. And then he lied as a desperate way to glorify what had actually happened. Despite his injuries being very minor, Churchill had claimed that he had ruptured a kidney and was left unconscious for 3 days as a result. Now, if someone had actually done that, no matter how healthy they are as an individual, they would more than likely die because of internal bleeding. And I'd imagine that if you'd ruptured your kidney and then started suffering with internal bleeding, then as far as I'm concerned, that's it. Your history, because it wouldn't take you very long to die at all. Now, Winston Churchill had actually failed his exams at the Sandhurst Academy twice. As a result of this, he was sent to the elite school of Captain Walter H. James, where he was given a private military tutor. However, this is what Captain Walter H. James had to say about Winston Churchill. Quote, "He is distinctly inclined to be inattentive and think too much of his own abilities." Close quote. Now, I definitely have my suspicions that the captain here was quite right, because it is perfectly clear that Winston Churchill was in no way going to give an impartial account of any events involving himself, either because he was incapable of doing so or because he was just unwilling to. This is really not surprising, to be honest, since it's not really anything new for the son of an aristocrat to basically have his head shoved so far up his own ass. After his military career, Winston Churchill then embarked on a political career where he unsuccessfully ran as a Tory MP in 2 elections, but then won a seat on his 3rd attempt in 1900. But Churchill then moved over to the Liberal Party in 1904, which is kind of interesting, and he stayed there until 1924 before going back to the Tory Party. Now, there may be some Churchill fanatics out there who will try and point out that Churchill put forward some progressive reforms. A small degree of this is true, since these reforms included 8-hour working days for miners, laws opposing anti-immigration bills, the enforcement of the minimum wage, breaks for workers, assistance in finding work, as well as unemployment insurance. He didn't do this because he liked the working class. He did this because liberals play a very opportunistic role in actually pacifying the workers in order to keep the capitalist system going. It's all part and parcel of the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. On a side note, Churchill was actually opposed to the Anti-Immigration Act of 1905, known as the Alien Act, which was basically to stop Jewish immigrants who were coming to the UK from Tsarist Russia because they were fleeing from extremely anti-Semitic pogroms. Churchill didn't argue to pass this reform to oppose the 1905 Anti-Immigration Act because he loved the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, the reality was quite the opposite, which is heavily backed up by his huge support for Zionism. But the biggest reason for why he passed this reform was because, as a system, capitalism actually benefits from the free movement of labour. This is seen with the basic tenets of the European Union today. It runs purely on the free movement of labour and the free movement of capital. It basically allows jobs to be exported to other countries at the expense of the workers who are employed in those jobs in their home countries, because it's more profitable for the capitalists. That's why I'm a Brexit supporter, because leaving the European Union would really hinder that and cause the ruling class to panic, followed by them doing anything and everything to save capitalism at the expense of the proletariat, leaving us with the good chance to step in and begin our work in building a revolutionary movement by showing how capitalism simply cannot and will not safeguard human life over profit. So even though Winston Churchill was not very popular with the Tories because of this reform, his views never lost the approval of the capitalists because they supported the free market. Now, for those of you watching this video who already have some knowledge of Winston Churchill, you would already probably know that Churchill was very far from being the happy and friendly bulldog that you see featured on the car insurance adverts, because to put it quite frankly, and to put it quite honestly, it is safe to say that Winston Churchill was very much a proper racist bastard. I say this because Churchill actually saw society as a racial hierarchy, and in particular he believed that white Protestants belonged at the very top of this hierarchy, since he was after all a white Protestant himself. He hated Catholics, he hated black people, he hated Jews, and this is why I see Winston Churchill as being no different from Adolf Hitler, who also viewed society as a racial hierarchy. A lot of British historians have made very futile attempts at actually defending Winston Churchill, even going as far as absolving his racism by saying that he was the man of his time and that by race he just meant culture. Many historians also go as far as to say that Churchill may have been very prejudiced, but he wasn't a bigot. Yeah, try not to laugh. I don't really know how being prejudiced to a group of people purely because of their nationality or the colour of their skin differs from being a bigot, but I guess it kinda does say a lot about the professionals we're meant to be looking up to. About the silly argument that I constantly hear from right-wingers who state that had it not been for Churchill, I'd be speaking German. Let me just correct you on that. What you are doing is preaching a very racist slur against German people. Just because someone speaks German, or just because someone comes from Germany, it does not automatically make them a Nazi. There were plenty of very famous cases of German military personnel in the Wehrmacht during the war actually defecting to the Red Army. Plus, the values and culture that was seen in East Germany, a socialist state that was under communist rule, were far better and much different to what was seen beforehand under Nazism, as they revolved around friendship, cooperation, promoting the working people who create the wealth of the country, instead of being hateful towards groups of workers because of the size of their noses, or going on witch hunts for people who were not classed as Aryan, or propagating this ridiculous view of class collaborationism, which argues that workers are somehow on the same level as capitalists and aristocrats. As a response to this hilarious view of the average proud Brit on Winston Churchill that we'd all be speaking German had it not been for him, let me just remind you that Winston Churchill was in no way an anti-fascist of any kind. The BBC have even pointed this out, and they're the pipeline of the British establishment. The BBC was the same corporation which had right-wing journalists trying to justify fascist lunatics from Britain First getting getting blind drunk, pissing on war memorials, and hunting down innocent black people to beat the shit out of. What's worse is that the police who were repressing the anti-racist protesters were just standing by when the white supremacists came out to play. Also, don't try and tell me that the police were being strict because the anti-racist protesters were violent, because when the protests all kicked off in the United States after the murder of George Floyd, it was the ruling class sending the police to throw tear gas at the protesters and to shoot at them with rubber bullets that began all the violence. It started off as a peaceful protest, but then the ruling class came to repress the spontaneous outburst of angry working people, which only made the angry working people even more angry. During the struggle for the civil rights of black people in the US, Martin Luther King consistently protested peacefully, even though he had his house burnt down to the ground by the Ku Klux Klan, which is a Christian fundamentalist group, and Martin Luther King was even shot dead by racists. Let that sink in. This should really be a reflection of the far right being the foot soldiers of the ruling class, because when the far right were carrying Nazi swastikas, Confederate flags, and causing chaos to protest against the lockdown measures that were being enforced because of the advice of scientists who actually know what they're doing and intend to research this new and deadly virus, which doesn't have a vaccine yet to make people better, the pathetic far right nutters were banging on about their hilarious and very unscientific conspiracy theories that the coronavirus is somehow a giant hoax, or how the lockdown was an example of socialism being when government does stuff. Yeah, I don't think that a lockdown being enforced because of the very serious threat to people's health that COVID-19 has become is really the same as the collective ownership over the means of production by the working class. Now back to Churchill. Throughout the 1930s, Churchill was actually very sympathetic towards fascism. He idolized Benito Mussolini in Italy, he was very friendly with Franco in Spain, and up until 1938, Churchill was even getting incredibly cozy with Adolf Hitler as well. When Churchill had written the Strand magazine in the 1930s, he openly stated that he admired Hitler's so-called patriotic achievements and referred to him as an indomitable champion. Winston Churchill also admired Mussolini, as I just said, and he even said to him, quote, "If I had been an Italian, I'm sure I would have been entirely with you from the beginning of your victorious struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism." Close quote. As to the argument that racism was the norm in Churchill's time, you only have to read the writings of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin on the national question to prove that wrong, and to see that progressive politics was most definitely a thing back in those days as well. In Tsarist Russia, before the Soviet Union existed, what you need to bear in mind is that Tsarist Russia was an empire. There were not just Russians living there. You also had Uzbeks, Ukrainians, Azerbaijanis, Kazakhs, Georgians, basically a multitude of different nationalities and cultures. However, under the tyrannical rule of the Tsarist Empire, all of these different nationalities, they had no rights whatsoever. So what the Soviet Union did was actually change that with a proletarian culture where these ethnic groups were granted with a lot of rights, like being able to speak their native language, being able to study in their own language, and so on. Of course, Russian was still the predominant language, since it was the biggest republic and everything, but you wouldn't be persecuted for being an Uzbek or for wanting to study in Ukrainian because it's your first language that you feel more confident using. The Soviet people essentially proved through the dictatorship of the proletariat and by showing how we are all divided into classes that there is absolutely no justification for any kind of racism. In fact, racism was actually illegal in the USSR, so you couldn't discriminate against someone because they came from a different country or had a different skin color. In the most extreme cases, racism in the Soviet Union was even punishable by death, and rightly so. If you agitate for racism and you organize into racist groups that victimize innocent people purely because of the color of their skin, the language they speak, or where they come from, then I'm sorry, but you're the fucking scum of the earth as far as I'm concerned. The only basis that people are divided by is class. Specifically capitalists and workers. Of course, there are separate categories in between, but that will be a topic for another video. But the point I'm getting at here is that I don't care how old you are. Racism is not something you're born with. Nobody is born as a bigot. It is something that they are taught, and it can be unlearned. Of course, you don't fight white supremacy with black supremacy, but you do fight racism with solidarity, and that's what the Soviet Union was all about. They were internationalists. They did not just love the working people of their own country, they also expressed solidarity with workers of other countries too. Just because it is worth throwing in there, many black Americans actually fled from the United States to the Soviet Union to escape the racial persecution they were facing back home, which is very eye-opening. Even though the USA was basically built by black people, they were seen and also still are seen as second-class citizens.
If you ask an averagely educated Russian, name some famous black person from Russian history, they will probably mention Abram Ganibal, who lived at the beginning of the 18th century, and whom they know about because he was an ancestor of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's national writer. But there were hardly any black people of any renown who did anything sufficiently noteworthy for people to know about them, really until the 1920s, when American black people started going to Soviet Russia.
Коммунистические пропагандисты говорили, что буржуазная демократия – это вывеска. И за этой вывеской на самом деле власть буржуазии, власть капиталистов, власть денежного мешка. Надо сказать, что в значительной степени так и было. Они обещали что-то новое, они обещали новое общество.
My grandmother was named Williana Jones, and then she married a man named Charles Burroughs, so she became Williana Jones Burroughs. They were activists for better rights for black people in general. And so she became more and more interested in the Soviet Union and more and more interested in going there. And she started going to the international congresses of the Communist Party. But then, I think it was 1929 when she actually went to the one in the Soviet Union.
There was a special interest in blacks in the first place, is that Lenin himself proclaimed that this is a part of humanity that's a very good symbol of what's wrong with capitalism and imperialism. And so blacks were singled out as a good illustration, especially of what the leading capitalist economies were doing. They needed skilled labor to come in and try to build their economy. They wanted to be one of the world's leading economies. They recruited thousands of Americans, and they were able to do this in part because the Great Depression had come about in the West. So they were recruiting people from every place.
Of course, the industrialization process of Russia economy, of Soviet Russia economy, was impossible without technology coming from the United States. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was taking certain political decisions.
And it was finally realized that the Russians knew a lot more about us than we knew about them. You need to know your enemy, right? They saw that the race problem in the United States was a convenient example to hold up to the world.
Black bodies swinging.
It was very attractive to certain individuals who were adventurous enough to try someplace else, even if they weren't sure what it was going to be like.
Я полечу отсюда быстрее птиц домой.
Я родился в России, ну тогда это был Советский Союз, мои родители из Америки. Папа у меня Черный американец, мама белая американка. Вот они приехали, здесь познакомились, они не знали в Америке друг друга. И родили меня и сестру, которая сейчас уже в Америке, а вот я здесь. Когда он приехал сюда, он увидел, что огромное количество людей, и в первую очередь женщин, просто боготворили его. Здесь он получил такую порцию внимания, что он поехал в первую очередь за этим вниманием, понимая также, что из этого он извлечет еще и рабочую пользу.
Масса, капитан. Разрешите мне вывез этого повара на завтрак акулам. В последнее время он мало интересует.
They found that in societies where class was more important than color, W.E.B. Du Bois called them the talented tenth.
Меня зовут Елена Ханга, и мои бабушка и дедушка приехали в 28 году из Америки, из Нью-Йорка в Советский Союз, а точнее их отправили в Узбекистан. Мой дедушка, поскольку он был афроамериканец, а моя бабушка была белая, польская еврейка, они бежали от расизма. А мой дедушка был специалистом по хлопку. Он же из Миссисипи сам. Поэтому он и поехал в Ташкент, где, как мы знаем, вот житница вся хлопка. Именно в это время Советский Союз закупал машины перерабатывающие, и он обучал узбекских специалистов, хлопкоробов, как правильно механизированно обрабатывать хлопок.
Churchill, however, was very critical of the Soviet Union. Surprise, surprise, saying that the Soviet system was somehow prejudiced against the so-called chosen people. When he was saying the chosen people, he was referring to Nazi Germany's extreme anti-Semitism, since he was very supportive of it. The truth about Winston Churchill was that his racist and national chauvinistic views were in full support of the horrific lines that were always used to justify the global exploitation, plunder, and oppression that was being carried out by the British Empire. What the British Empire was doing was nothing like what the United States does today. When the US carries out acts of imperialism by throwing extremely debilitating sanctions on different countries, taking over the markets and resources of different countries, and even bombing different countries to get hold of their resources, it's always on the grounds of quote-unquote freedom or democracy. The British Empire, on the other hand, was just openly empire building on the grounds of quote-unquote civilizing the uncivilized and the savages. Yeah, I'm not kidding, the British actually did that. It really does annoy me when I see right-wing boneheads banging on about how it's unpatriotic to hate Winston Churchill, a man who never represented the interests of the British proletariat whatsoever. And the fact that they have the nerve to turn around and preach about how we should all understand our history, to then totally dismiss the valuable information you give them by saying, oh, it's in the past, just move on. They just show how ignorant they are, that they have to turn the argument into a personal hissy fit against you because they're so butthurt over the fact that you're right and they are wrong. I'll tell you something, when you actually sit down and take the time to learn the history of Winston Churchill, to know what he actually stood for, you'll be able to see that whoever wrote that graffiti on his statue on Parliament Square in London during the Black Lives Matter protests was actually writing the truth. Any history student who therefore struggles to see the difference between a quote by Adolf Hitler and a quote by Winston Churchill would have a very good reason to be feeling confused, because both were incredibly racist people who were the representations of the capitalist class, which was and still is today hurled against the working people. Churchill's position on genocide, for example, was very much on par with Hitler's, as he believed it to not only be justifiable but also necessary. On top of this, due to his support for the Zionist state of Israel, Winston Churchill may have managed to present himself as the saviour of the Jewish people after World War II. But ethnic cleansing was very much on his agenda, since the Zionist state of Israel treats the Palestinian people very much like how the apartheid regime in South Africa treated the country's indigenous people. With Israel, they are basically colonizing Palestine and holding the very backwards belief that Jews only belong in one country. So it is no wonder why an anti-Semite in the likes of Winston Churchill would support such a racist and genocidal project. I say this because many Jews actually hated Zionism. I've done a video which details the history of Israeli imperialism, so a link to that is in the description if you're interested. In 1937, when the British were still stationed in Palestine, Churchill said to the Palestinian Royal Commission, quote, "I do not admit that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or to the black people of Australia by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, has come in and taken its place." Close quote. Yeah, let that sink in. Because this is the same racist bastard who has a statue on Parliament Square in London and who is seen as a great patriot by the British establishment, along with the right-wing boneheads. Let me just remind you that it was Winston Churchill who sent the troops to crush the Welsh miners in 1910 who went out on strike in Tonypandy, which is up in the valleys by Merthyr. This is what he had to say about the Welsh, and this just infuriates me. Quote, "If the Welsh are striking over hunger, then we shall fill their bellies with lead." Close quote. Now, I know for a fact that not a lot of Welsh people think very much of Winston Churchill because of this, especially as he also sent the police and the military to suppress the general strike of 1926, where the miners, the railway workers and the steel workers of Wales and Northern England basically banded together to go on strike. However, they do get cold feet when the Second World War is in question.
After the war, Winston Churchill had many accolades. This, the freedom of Cardiff.
Very glad indeed to come to Cardiff.
But 20 miles or so up the road in the Rhondda, it wasn't his actions during the war that mattered, but his actions before it, in the Tonypandy riots. The archive records the memories of those who were there.
Churchill sent soldiers here, then that's why they don't like Churchill here, like, see? Because he sent the soldiers here, like.
The Tonypandy riots were the culmination of a dispute between local miners and mine owners. Shops were smashed. A man died. Churchill, as Home Secretary, sent in the troops. It's amazing looking at this photo that this is history, and it happened right here.
Yes, sure, that's right.
David Maddox is a local historian who studied the riots.
And here they're coming into Tonypandy. This is the night after the rioting and looting of the town, when 63 of the shops were looted. Once the military came in, that finished the strike as far as the miners are concerned. They couldn't win.
For many, he's a great war hero. But the bitterness that was here, how did it present itself?
He went to the cinemas here, and as soon as Churchill's picture came up on screen, the war hero, people were booing and hissing and throwing oranges at the screen.
There's a lot of history in these valleys, and they like to document it. And the Tonypandy riots are no different. But just over 107 years later, what is the perception of Winston Churchill today? How do the people of Tonypandy feel about him? I've been asking them, and it's fair to say it's still mixed.
So that's why they like him,
but do they like?
Because he sent the soldiers.
What do you think people feel about him now in Tonypandy?
Well, it's still the same, I expect.
Still a bit of negative feeling?
Yeah.
Well, he was a great man, wasn't he?
Yes.
Took us through the war.
Think the Tonypandy riots then have been forgotten now by the generations?
No, it would never be forgotten, will it?
But you've forgiven Churchill?
Yes.
Some feel there's nothing to forgive him for, that he was reluctant to use force and a myth about his role was created. Nevertheless, the name Churchill is remembered in this valley for some very different reasons to the rest of the UK.
Even though from the perspectives of Britain and Germany, the Second World War was a mere continuation of the First World War, which was an imperialist war on both sides, because the ruling classes of the different colonial empires began to compete over different territories to determine which power could dominate the resources and the labour of a certain territory. This is why when the Bolsheviks had published the secret treaties between the imperialist countries, it revealed that the First World War was a massive slaughter of workers who were put into military uniforms. Let me also remind you that it was Winston Churchill who put together a paramilitary division called the RIC Special Reserve, which consisted of veterans from the British Army who served in the First World War to massacre the Irish people in the 1920s when they were struggling for their independence from British colonialism. These lovely bunch of chaps who very often shot at civilians, damaged civilian property, burnt cities, towns and villages to the ground and prevented firefighters from putting out the flames, much like what the the SA did in Nazi Germany during Kristallnacht were also known as the Black and Tans, hence the reason for the famous IRA song Come Out Ye Black and Tans. I will also remind you that Winston Churchill was one of the masterminds behind the Bengal famine that happened in India in 1943. India, as you probably already know, was a British colony, and when the British Empire was around, they stole a lot of natural resources and wealth from the colonized countries to basically benefit the British Empire's trading markets. It was to deliver a massive profit to the British ruling class. The state was basically doing the colonizing, and the capitalists were essentially doing the looting. Now, during World War II, this plundering was increased significantly as the British were stealing more and more resources from India, as well as all of the other colonies, to not only benefit the war effort, but to also secure giant profits for the British Empire. They treated Indian workers and workers throughout the vast territories of the British Empire absolutely horribly to gather these resources, and then they would basically be forced to give them to the British Empire. This was one of the biggest factors behind the Bengal famine of 1943, but the worst part of it was that Churchill actually blamed the Indians for this famine. Here's what he had to say about them, and it just horrifies me to even read this. Quote, I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine is their own fault for breeding like rabbits. Close quote. I know. What an evil bastard. Just think about that for a second. Right-wingers very often try to blame Chairman Mao for the famine that hit China during the Great Leap Forward, despite the fact that China was finally coming out of feudalism in the midst of a very intense class struggle, and the Chinese Revolution was one of the biggest revolutions to happen in history. The whole idea behind the Great Leap Forward was to modernize China and pull it away from the medieval times, because before the Great Leap Forward, famines were very common in China, and these famines had way more devastating results as well. You could argue that Mao had picked the wrong time for the Great Leap Forward to go ahead. Hell, I would even argue that there were mistakes made during Mao's leadership. However, under Mao, China's GDP grew rapidly, and China became better because of that intense class struggle under Mao. Mao even went as far as to feel guilty and to even empathize with those who suffered during the Great Leap Forward. In fact, he even went as far as to criticize his own policies. If that doesn't deserve honor, then I don't know what does. On the contrary, India's GDP when the country was under the British colonial rule had actually shrunk significantly. Oh, and while I'm on the subject, have a guess where the royal family's crown jewels came from. That's right, India. Have a guess where most of Britain's wealth has come from. That's right, colonialism. If the right-wing proud Brits actually knew their history and not just swallowed the system's propaganda, they'd more than likely be just like me, and I will say this with my hand on my heart. The more I learn about the history of my country, the more I actually get the odd moment where I feel ashamed and even embarrassed to be British. This is because the ruling class here often likes to distort the history of the British Empire and even keep it all quiet by saying, oh, it was a long time ago, which basically has the same logic of, oh, that never happened, and then they act completely clueless as to why national liberation movements that have been and who are still fighting against the British Armed Forces actually exist in the first place. Let me tell you that the use of concentration camps is not merely a Nazi phenomenon, and the use of chemical weapons is not merely an American phenomenon. These were both tactics which were pioneered by the British Empire in its colonies that the Nazis and later the Americans started adopting as part of their imperialist expansions. To any proud Brits out there watching this, if there is anyone I would compare Adolf Hitler to, it is definitely not Joseph Stalin, because when the Nazis were becoming a problem, Stalin put his foot up their asses and sent them back to Berlin. He even offered to work with Britain and France to fight against them, only to be ignored by both Britain and France while facing opposition from Poland, who were all sympathetic to Hitler in his cause to crush the communists. Unlike Churchill, Stalin was not fighting for an empire on behalf of the capitalists. He was fighting for the mere existence of the Soviet people and for the liberation of the proletariat all across the world. As well as this, contrary to the disgusting resolution that was passed by the European Union in October of 2019 that attempted to brush away the very significant role of communists in defeating the Nazis, it was actually the communists who did much of the fighting against the Nazis. Not just the Red Army, but also Soviet guerrilla forces operating behind the Red Army and partisan resistance movements all over Europe, even on the British Channel Islands that are just off the coast of France, islands which were occupied by the Nazis during the war. The only people who stood up and fought against the Nazis were the partisans. Why? Well, communists were not fighting to ensure the safety of the profits of the capitalists who had domination over a particular territory. They were fighting for the future of humanity against fascism, the most desperate form of capitalism that will do anything and everything to cripple the proletariat. For this, humanity offers them a great deal of gratitude. The communists stand for the workers and the oppressed of the world, unlike the British Empire and their Nazi counterparts, who viewed society with a racial hierarchy and who carried out open and brutal imperialism. To all the proud Brits and anti-communists who may be watching this, the point I must emphasize on is that I would very much compare your beloved Winston Churchill to Adolf Hitler. Therefore, if you still see Churchill as a hero, I would highly recommend that you look a lot more into his history. Unless, of course, you're still fucking ignorant enough to tell me to shut up, understand my history, only to then turn around and dismiss all the facts by saying, oh, it's in the past, just move on. I will say it with my hand on my heart. I am not here because of Winston Churchill. Churchill would more than likely hate my guts, and he would have been more than happy to throw me into an internment camp. Had it not been for Stalin and the Red Army, who stood with the proletariat of the world, I would not be here today uploading these videos for you all to see. After the Second World War, the fact that the Soviet Union and the working class movement were becoming very powerful and began to threaten the ruling class and push them into a corner, forcing them to make a compromise with the working people, are one of the biggest reasons for why we were given concessions by the ruling class as a way to pacify us. These are none other than the NHS and the welfare state, and they are rightly appreciated by British workers, but they are slowly being eroded away because the bourgeoisie now feel as though they can kick the boot in. One of the biggest reasons for this being that the Soviet Union, the mothership of the proletariat, no longer exists because of fucking Gorbachev. Now for the punchline that you've all been waiting for. Whoever wrote that graffiti on the statue of Churchill on Parliament Square in London has been far more historically accurate than the British ruling class has ever been for decades. I'm serious. The British establishment actually glorifies this murdering, xenophobic and fascist sympathising piece of shit. I see firsthand the effects of it manifesting in the average proud Brit who knows next to nothing about Britain's colonial past and why we should be teaching people about it, because, as the old saying goes, those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. This is evident when we see the far-right loonies attacking other groups of workers while harking back to the UK's imperial glory days. They look at the British Empire that murdered, pillaged and even displaced millions of people across the world with blind nostalgia, but then become totally clueless as to why national liberation movements, which fought against and in some cases are now fighting against British imperialism, actually began to exist in the first place. By doing this, they are acting in favour of the ruling class by creating a huge distraction with their racist worldviews, because they turn the attention of the masses away from the capitalist system which causes their problems by redirecting the anger of the masses towards other workers instead. It is a very old and sneaky trick called divide and rule, and it's been used by minority ruling classes for centuries. Think about this for a second. The next time you see a right-wing bonehead trying to make an excuse as to why these sorts of statues should be preserved and glorified, just remember that it was these same buffoons who remained totally silent and even very supportive of the fact that all across Eastern Europe, ever since the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Socialist Warsaw Pact as a whole, which was actually against the democratic will of the people in those countries, a lot of Eastern European countries have been seeing a very disturbing rise in fascism, and the current governments of Poland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria and Hungary are governments that are extremely right-wing and have full support from the European Union, NATO and the United States. Well, it was these same right-wing governments that have been tearing down statues and monuments that were dedicated to the Soviet forces and the partisan resistance movements that fought the Nazis, liberated the Eastern European countries from fascist barbarism and replaced a tyrannical right-wing extremist rule with a people's democracy, a society in which the working people had an exceptional role and a very high level of involvement in the running of the country. At the same time, especially in Poland. Communists have been getting repressed because the bourgeoisie still trembles at the memory of the mighty proletarian force which was the Warsaw Pact, an alliance of socialist countries which had the economic and military strength which rivaled that of NATO. On top of this, it was the socialist countries that stood against colonialism, that stood against imperialism, that stood with struggles for national liberation and for proletarian internationalism. In other words, the socialist countries stood for the future of humanity, while the likes of Winston Churchill merely stood as the front men of the bourgeoisie by providing policies to suit their interests of accumulating profit at the expense of the working people and the oppressed masses of the world. So, to conclude, this is why I hold the belief that the Red Army really shouldn't have stopped in Germany. And I think this video explains why.